The way most people completely misunderstand avoidant psychology because they listen only to words while ignoring emotional behavior. And that's the mistake that destroys so many potentially meaningful connections. Avoidants are rarely direct in the beginning stages of love. In fact, the more deeply they feel something, the more likely they are to disguise it, intellectualize it, or communicate it indirectly. That's why when an avoidant says certain seemingly harmless phrases, you have to understand what is happening underneath psychologically. When someone says, "I've never opened up like this before," that is not casual conversation for an avoidant personality. That sentence represents emotional risk. It represents internal conflict, because avoidants are wired to protect emotional independence above almost everything else. Vulnerability to them can feel dangerous. Dependence can feel like weakness. Emotional exposure can feel like loss of control. So when they begin revealing private thoughts, painful memories, personal fears, or emotional truths they normally hide from the world, something significant is already happening internally. And this is where people misread them. They experiment. I love to look dramatic, expressive, and emotionally obvious. But avoidants often experience love in silence before they ever express it verbally. Their attachment grows privately, internally, slowly, sometimes even unconsciously. Long before they admit feelings to another person, they are already fighting psychological battles inside themselves. They are trying to understand why your presence affects them differently. Why do they think about you when they are alone? Why they suddenly feel emotionally exposed in conversations that would normally remain surface level. You'll hear phrases like, "You're different. I don't usually talk this much. I feel strangely comfortable with you. I can actually relax around you." Now, to the average person, these statements may sound small, but psychologically, these are enormous admissions for someone with avoidant tendencies. Because what they are really saying is, my nervous system feels safe enough to lower its defenses around you. And for avoidance, safety is everything. Understand this clearly. Avoidants do not fear love itself as much as they fear what love might require from them emotionally. They fear losing autonomy. They fear being consumed. They fear abandonment after vulnerability. Many of these patterns were formed years earlier through emotional inconsistency, disappointment, rejection, or environments where emotional needs were ignored. So they learned a survival strategy. Stay self-contained, stay emotionally guarded, and never need anyone too deeply. But then someone enters their life who disrupts that entire system. And suddenly they start communicating in contradictions. They pull closer, then retreat. They become vulnerable, then distant. They initiate connection, then act emotionally overwhelmed afterward. This confuses people because they interpret inconsistency as manipulation or lack of care. Sometimes it is. But many times, especially with avoidance, inconsistency is the visible symptom of internal emotional conflict. Part of them wants connection. Another part is terrified by how real the connection feels. That's why indirect language matters so much in avoidant psychology. Their emotional truth often leaks out before conscious admission catches up. Their behavior starts confessing emotions before their words do. They may remember tiny details about you. They may prioritize time with three of you unexpectedly. They may check on you during difficult moments. They may slowly allow you access to parts of their inner world that almost nobody sees. And here's the deeper philosophical truth. Human beings reveal their deepest emotions long before they fully understand them intellectually. Love is not always announced clearly at first. Sometimes it emerges through subtle shifts in attention, emotional openness, and vulnerability. Especially in people who spent years convincing themselves they didn't need anyone. So when an avoidant begins speaking in ways that reveal emotional trust, don't dismiss it because it doesn't look traditionally romantic. For them, emotional exposure is already an act of intimacy. And often, by the time they say these subtle phrases, they are already far deeper in love than they are ready to admit. Because the first sign an avoidant is falling in love is not emotional intensity, it's emotional permission. One of the most damaging misconceptions people carry into relationships is the belief that emotional distance automatically means emotional absence. They assume that if someone pulls away, becomes quiet, asks for space, or struggles to express affection, consistently, then the feelings must not be real. But avoidant psychology teaches us something far more complicated and far more human. Sometimes distance is not the absence of love. Sometimes distance is what happens when love collides with fear. And this is where people completely misunderstand avoidance. Most avoidant individuals are not running from connection because they feel nothing. They are running because they feel too much and don't know how to regulate the emotional intensity that closeness creates inside them. That distinction changes everything, because externally their behavior can look cold, detached, or indifferent. But internally, many avoidants are experiencing emotional overload. You have to understand how the avoidant nervous system operates. For someone with avoidant attachment patterns, intimacy can unconsciously trigger danger signals. Not because love itself is dangerous, but because closeness threatens the emotional defenses they spent years building. These defenses were not created randomly. They were survival mechanisms. Somewhere earlier in life, they learned that vulnerability led to disappointment, emotional unpredictability, criticism, ejection, or loss of autonomy. So they adapted by becoming emotionally self-reliant. They learned to suppress needs before those needs could be ignored. They learned to detach before they could be hurt. They learned to control emotions instead of fully experiencing them. And for a while, that strategy works. It creates stability. It creates independence. It creates the illusion of strength. But then real connection enters their life, and suddenly the emotional walls that once protected them begin to feel unstable. This is why avoidants often become most distant precisely when the relationship becomes emotionally meaningful. Think about the paradox here. Most people move closer when they feel love growing. Avoidants often do the opposite. As intimacy deepens, their internal alarms activate. They begin overthinking interactions. They analyze vulnerability instead of relaxing into it. They feel the emotional weight of being needed, depended on, or emotionally seen. And instead of interpreting that closeness as comfort, their nervous system may interpret it as pressure. So they pull back, not always because they want less connection. Sometimes because they are terrified of how important the connection is becoming. And this creates confusion for their partner. Because the partner thinks, if you love me, why are you becoming distant? But psychologically, emotional withdrawal is often the avoidance attempt to regain internal equilibrium. Distance becomes a coping mechanism. Solitude becomes emotional regulation. Space becomes safety. Now, this does not mean every emotionally unavailable person is secretly in love. That's important to understand. Some people are genuinely disconnected, manipulative, or uninterested. But with avoidance, there is often a visible pattern. The closer the emotional bond becomes, the stronger the internal conflict appears. You'll notice moments where they deeply engage, then suddenly retreat. Moments where they show vulnerability, then emotionally shut down afterward. Moments where they crave intimacy, then feel overwhelmed by it. This emotional push and pull is exhausting not only for the partner, but for the avoidant themselves. Because part of them genuinely wants closeness. Human beings are wired for connection. But another part fears losing control, losing independence, or experiencing emotional pain they never fully feel, ailed from. And philosophically, this reveals something profound about human nature. People do not only avoid what hurts them, sometimes they avoid what has the power to transform them. Love challenges identity. It exposes unresolved wounds. It forces emotional honesty. And for someone who built their entire sense of safety around emotional distance, intimacy can feel psychologically destabilizing. That's why patience and awareness matter so much when dealing with avoidant personalities. You cannot interpret every retreat as rejection. Sometimes it is fear speaking louder than emotion. Sometimes silence is not emptiness, it is emotional overwhelm hidden behind self-protection. Because in avoidant psychology, the greatest tragedy is this. The person who feels the deepest connection is often the very person most afraid to fully surrender to it. And until fear stops controlling the nervous system, love will always struggle to speak clearly. One of the deepest truths about avoidant psychology is that avoidants do not fall in love through pressure, intensity, or emotional pursuit. They fall in love through safety. And most people completely underestimate how important emotional safe tie is to someone whose entire personality structure was built around self-protection. You have to remember, avoidants are constantly scanning relationships for threats to their independence, emotional stability, and sense of control. This is happening consciously sometimes, but unconsciously most of the time. They may appear calm on the outside while internally evaluating every emotional interaction. Can this person be trusted? Will this relationship become emotionally consuming? Will vulnerability eventually turn into disappointment? Will closeness lead to obligation, criticism, or abandonment? These questions exist beneath the surface even when they never say them out loud. And this is why avoidants test people before they fully commit emotionally. Not necessarily through manipulation, but through observation, through distance, through inconsistency, through subtle emotional experiments designed to answer one central question. Am I safe being emotionally real with you? Now, most people fail these tests without realizing it. Why? because they react emotionally to the avoidance defenses instead of understanding them psychologically. The avoidant pulls away and the other person. 3, a son panics. The avoidant becomes quiet and the partner starts demanding reassurance. The avoidant asks for space and suddenly emotional pressure intensifies. But pressure is exactly what reinforces the avoidant's fear in the first place. This creates a destructive cycle. The more emotionally overwhelmed the avoidant feels, the more distance they create. The more distance they create, the more anxious the partner becomes. The more anxious the partner becomes, the more pressure enters the relationship. And the more pressure exists, the more unsafe intimacy feels for the avoidant. So what actually changes an avoidant over time is not force. It's consistency. Consistency is psychologically powerful because it slowly retrains the nervous system. When someone remains emotionally steady without becoming controlling, reactive, or emotionally chaotic, the avoidant begins lowering defenses little by little, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. This is why small behaviors matter so much with avoidance. Do they come back after withdrawing? Do they slowly reveal more personal information? Do they begin initiating contact more often? Do they start including you in future ori? Entertain conversations? Do they check on you emotionally in subtle ways? These behaviors may seem ordinary to secure personalities, but for avoidance, they often represent major internal shifts. Because emotionally avoidant people do not naturally move toward dependence or vulnerability. If they are consistently moving closer despite their fears, it usually means trust is forming underneath the surface. And trust is the foundation of love for an avoidant personality. Not excitement, not chemistry alone, not emotional intensity. 3 is safety, because what avoidants secretly want is not endless distance. It's connection without emotional danger. They want to feel accepted without losing themselves. They want intimacy that does not suffocate autonomy. They want closeness that feels emotionally stable rather than emotionally demanding. And philosophically, this reflects one of the great human paradoxes. People open their hearts not when they are chased hardest, but when they feel safest being fully seen. Real intimacy is not built through emotional force. It is built through psychological permission. This is why avoidants often take longer to fully trust love. Their emotional system is originally designed for instant surrender. It is designed for careful observation. Every consistent interaction becomes evidence. Every calm response during conflict becomes evidence. Every moment where vulnerability is met with understanding instead of judgment becomes evidence. Over time, those experiences begin rewriting the internal narrative they've carried for years. Maybe closeness is not weakness. Maybe dependence is not loss of control. Maybe vulnerability does not always end in pain. And when that shift finally begins happening internally, something powerful changes. The avoidant stops relating to the relationship through fear alone. They begin participating emotionally instead of merely protecting themselves psychologically. That is when love starts becoming visible. Not because they suddenly become emotionally perfect, but because their actions slowly become more courageous than their defenses. Because the moment an avoidant stops testing whether love is safe is usually the moment they're finally ready to experience it fully. One of the most misunderstood phrases in modern relationships is when an avoidant says, "I need space." Most people hear those words and immediately, translate them into rejection. They assume the relationship is ending, the feelings are fading, or emotional detachment has already happened. And sometimes that interpretation is true. But in avoidant psychology, space often means something very different. It is not always an escape from love. Sometimes it is an attempt to manage the intensity of it. That distinction matters because avoidants experience emotional closeness differently than most people. For many individuals, intimacy creates comfort, reassurance, and emotional grounding. But for someone with avoidant attachment patterns, intimacy can activate internal stress responses. The closer the connection becomes, the more emotionally exposed they feel. And emotional exposure, especially if they grew up associating vulnerability with pain or instability, can feel psychologically overwhelming. So when emotions intensify, their instinct is often not to move closer, but to retreat temporarily in order to regulate themselves. This is where people become confused. They think, if you truly cared about me, why would you need distance? But psychologically, avoidants often need space precisely because they care. The relation. Their ship begins affecting them emotionally in ways they cannot fully control, and that loss of emotional control feels threatening to their nervous system. You have to understand, avoidants are not usually comfortable sitting inside emotional intensity for long periods of time. Deep connection challenges the identity they built around independence and emotional self-sufficiency. Suddenly, there is another person whose presence matters deeply. Another person capable of influencing their emotional state. Another person they could potentially lose. And with that attachment comes vulnerability, responsibility, uncertainty, and fear. So they step back, not necessarily because the feelings disappeared, sometimes because the feelings became too real. Now, this does not excuse emotionally damaging behavior. Needing space is one thing. Disappearing without communication, creating chronic confusion, or emotionally neglecting someone repeatedly is another. Emotional maturity still matters. Accountability still matters. But understanding the psychology behind avoidant withdrawal allows you to stop personalizing every moment of distance as proof that love never existed. In fact, one of the clear 3 EST patterns in avoidant psychology is this. When the emotional connection deepens, the nervous system often responds with contradiction. Part of them wants intimacy. Another part experiences intimacy as emotional overload. So they alternate between closeness and retreat, connection and silence, vulnerability and emotional shutdown. And from the outside, this inconsistency can feel painful and disorienting. But internally, the avoidant is often fighting 2 competing desires at the same time. I want connection, I need safety. The tragedy is that they often confuse emotional space with emotional safety. Solitude becomes their way of regaining control over emotions they were never taught to process properly. Instead of communicating fear directly, they withdraw. Instead of expressing overwhelm openly, they become distant. Space becomes their emotional regulation strategy. And philosophically, this reveals something profound about human behavior. People do not always run from what they hate. Sometimes they run from what has the power to affect them most deeply. Love destabilizes emotional defenses. It exposes unhealed wounds. It forces confrontation with dependency, uncertainty, why, and vulnerability. And for avoidance, that experience can feel terrifying even when the love itself is genuine. This is why context matters so much. If someone asks for space and permanently disconnects emotionally, avoids accountability, and shows no effort to reconnect, that may reflect detachment. But if they consistently return, attempt reconnection, reopen communication, or slowly move back toward intimacy after periods of withdrawal, it often signals something different entirely. It signals that the emotional bond still exists underneath the fear. Because avoidants do not always process love through continuous closeness. Many process it through cycles of connection and emotional recalibration. Their nervous system needs time to absorb vulnerability that secure individuals might handle more naturally. And eventually, if growth occurs, they begin learning an important lesson. Emotional safety is not found by running from intimacy. It is found by developing the capacity to remain emotionally present within it. Because real love is not measured by the absence of fear, it is measured by the willingness to return despite it. One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to understand avoidance is focusing only on what they say instead of observing how they change. Because when an avoidant truly falls in love, the most important evidence is rarely found in dramatic declarations or emotional speeches. It appears in behavior, in patterns, in gradual but undeniable shifts that begin altering the way they relate to another person. And this is important because avoidants are often not naturally expressive with emotions. Many grew up learning that feelings should be controlled, hidden, minimized, or handled alone. So even when love becomes real, they may still struggle to verbalize it consistently. But human behavior always reveals what the heart is investing in over time. Love changes priorities. Love changes attention. Love changes effort. That's true for every human being, including avoidants. You may notice they start making room for you in ways they never did before. They begin checking in more consistently. They start remembering details that matter to you. They become more considerate of your emotional state. They slowly allow you into routines, plans, and spaces that once felt deeply private. None of this happens accidentally. For someone, Threya, whose identity has been built around emotional independence, letting another person become emotionally significant is a profound internal shift. And the transformation is usually gradual. Avoidants rarely wake up one morning completely emotionally available. Growth tends to happen in layers. First, they tolerate closeness. Then they begin trusting it. Then eventually they start participating in it willingly instead of defensively. This is where people become impatient. They want instant reassurance, instant vulnerability, instant emotional fluency. But psychological conditioning developed over decades does not disappear overnight. Avoidants often have to learn emotional intimacy almost like a new language. They must retrain instincts that once told them vulnerability was unsafe. So when you see an avoidant beginning to communicate more openly, stay emotionally present during difficult conversations, or make consistent efforts despite discomfort, those changes matter deeply because they are moving against their old survival patterns. And survival patterns are powerful. You have to understand that avoidance is not just a dating habit. It is often an entire emotional operating. Presence 3, a system. It influences how people handle conflict, intimacy, dependency, disappointment, and even self-worth. Many avoidants learned early in life that relying on others created pain or instability, so they became hyper-independent emotionally. Self-containment became strength. Distance became protection. But real love eventually challenges that entire system, because love requires participation. It requires presence. It requires emotional risk. And this is why genuine love often transforms avoidance more through action than words. You begin seeing them make choices their old self would have avoided. They stay in conversations longer instead of shutting down immediately. They express concern instead of pretending indifference. They compromise instead of protecting autonomy at all costs. They begin considering we instead of only me. That evolution matters because behavior is where emotional truth becomes visible. Philosophically, this reflects something universal about human beings. Authentic love does not merely create emotion, it creates responsibility. When someone truly matters to you, your behavior naturally begins adapting around their emotional existence, not through obligation alone, but through investment. Love reorganizes attention. It reshapes priorities. It softens defenses over time. And avoidants are no exception to this human reality. In fact, when avoidants genuinely love someone, the transformation can be incredibly powerful precisely because it costs them so much internally. Every act of vulnerability challenges old fears. Every moment of emotional openness requires courage. Every step toward intimacy pushes against years of psychological conditioning. That's why consistency becomes more meaningful than intensity. Grand emotional moments can happen briefly with anyone, but sustained behavioral change reveals emotional depth. If an avoidant keeps showing up, keeps trying, keeps growing emotionally despite discomfort, that effort is often the clearest evidence of love you will ever receive from them. Because words can sometimes reflect intention, but behavior reflects commitment. And when an avoidant begins consistently choosing connection over self-protection, you are witnessing something rare. A person becoming stronger than the fear that once controlled them. At the deepest level, avoidant psychology is not really about the Freya B sense of love. It is about the presence of fear. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of dependence. Fear of losing control. Fear of being hurt in ways that once felt emotionally unbearable. And until that fear is understood, people will continue misinterpreting avoidance as emotionally cold when many are actually emotionally guarded. There is an important philosophical distinction there. A cold person feels nothing. A guarded person feels deeply, but protects those feelings behind psychological armor. And most avoidants spend years convincing themselves that distance equals strength. They become highly functional, independent, self-reliant individuals who appear emotionally composed on the surface. But underneath that composure is often a nervous system trained to associate vulnerability with danger. Somewhere along the way, they learned that emotional closeness came with pain, instability, disappointment, criticism, or abandonment. So they adapted, not because they were weak, because human beings adapt to survive emotionally. The problem is that survival strategies do not disappear automatically when healthier love enters someone's life. The nervous system keeps reacting based on old 3 experiences, even when the present relationship is safe. That is why avoidants can genuinely care about someone and still struggle to stay emotionally present consistently. Part of them wants connection, while another part is still operating from old emotional programming. And this is where healing begins becoming essential. Because eventually every avoidant reaches a psychological crossroads. They must decide whether they want to continue protecting themselves from pain or finally allow themselves to experience deeper intimacy fully. And that choice is terrifying because real love always requires surrendering some degree of emotional control. You cannot experience deep connection while remaining completely defended. You cannot receive unconditional love while hiding your authentic emotional self. You cannot build intimacy while treating vulnerability like weakness. At some point, the walls that once protected you begin isolating you. And this realization changes everything. Many avoidants eventually discover that the independence they were so proud of came with a hidden cost. Emotional loneliness. They mastered self-protection but struggled with emotional closeness. 3 learned how to avoid disappointment, but also avoided the depth of connection they secretly craved. Because no matter how independent a person becomes, human beings are fundamentally relational creatures. We are wired for connection, attachment, emotional resonance, and shared meaning. That truth cannot be fully escaped, only delayed. And this is why healing for avoidance is not about becoming emotionally perfect overnight. It is about slowly developing the courage to stay emotionally present instead of automatically retreating into protection. It is learning how to communicate fear instead of disguising it as distance. It is learning that needing people does not make you weak. It makes you human. Now, this process requires immense self-awareness because avoidants must begin confronting patterns they spent years normalizing. They must recognize when emotional withdrawal is happening. They must notice when fear is shaping behavior more than reality itself. They must learn how to tolerate vulnerability without immediately escaping from it psychologically. And perhaps most importantly, they must redefine what strength actually means. For years, strength may have meant emotional control, never needing anyone, never appearing vulnerable, never losing composure. But mature love teaches a different definition of strength. Real strength is honesty. Real strength is emotional responsibility. Real strength is remaining open even when uncertainty exists. Real strength is staying connected when every old instinct tells you to run. That is the transformation. And philosophically, this may be one of the greatest lessons hidden inside avoidant psychology. The goal of life is not merely self-protection. It is emotional integration. To become fully human means developing the capacity to experience love without allowing fear to dominate every decision. Because eventually, every avoidant discovers the same truth all human beings must face. Safety without connection becomes isolation, but connection without courage becomes impossible. And the moment fear stops controlling love, love finally becomes free to speak for itself. So when you step back and truly understand avoidant psychology, you begin realizing something most people never see. Avoidants are not emotionless people incapable of love. Very often they are people who learn to survive by controlling emotion. Threya so tightly that vulnerability started feeling dangerous. Their distance is not always indifference. Their silence is not always absence of feeling. And their contradictions are often the visible battle between longing for connection and fearing what connection requires emotionally. That's why the signs of love in an avoidant rarely appear in obvious ways at first. Love shows itself through subtle emotional permission, through trust, through gradual vulnerability, through the willingness to return after fear says run. While others may express love loudly, avoidants often express it carefully, indirectly, and behaviorally long before they fully verbalize it themselves. And this is where emotional maturity becomes essential. Because understanding avoidant psychology is not about romanticizing unhealthy behavior or endlessly chasing unavailable people. It is about learning to distinguish between someone who is emotionally fearful and someone who is emotionally unwilling. One can grow. One usually resists growth entirely. Real healing only happens when the avoidant becomes self-aware enough to confront the fear beneath the distance. That fear is the real barrier, not love itself. At the core of every avoidant pattern is a nervous system trying to stay safe. But eventually, every human being faces the same truth. A life built entirely around self-protection becomes emotionally lonely. Walls may prevent pain, but they also prevent depth, intimacy, and the kind of connection that gives life meaning. And this is why growth matters so much. The avoidant who begins choosing honesty over withdrawal, presence over distance, vulnerability over control, connection over fear, is no longer operating from survival. They are finally learning how to love freely. Because the deepest transformation in avoidant psychology happens the moment someone realizes that love was never the threat. The real threat was allowing fear to speak louder than the heart for too long. And once an avoidant finally feels safe enough to stop running from intimacy, they often discover what they were searching for all along. Not independence from love, but safety within it.